We're continuing in our learning series where we're looking at, little by little, this library of books that we call the Bible, and this collection of writings, and learning how to dig into these books, looking not for easy answers and quick solutions to the things that we struggle with, but for tools and inspiration to live with the wisdom that God offers us. And so far in the series, we've looked at books of history, we've looked at books of poetry, we've looked at books of prophecy. Next week, we're going to look at some books of what are basically philosophy, what a lot of scholars and people who study the Bible call wisdom books, but that's for next week. This week, I want to look at three writings, that don't sit easily in any of those categories. We're going to look at the stories of Noah and of Job and of Jonah. And these three books, these three writings, they're not all individual books, because Noah is part of the book of Genesis. They're very, very different from each other. And they're also very, very different from other books and other writings in the Bible. And they have all these curious, interesting little details that capture our imaginations. They have like an angelic council gathering, a heavenly accuser pointing the finger at a human being. There's this giant fish commuter bus where Jonah sits with his laptop and writes some amazingly beautiful poetry. Not bad for a guy who's like half drowned and he's got seaweed in his ears. Jonah's psalm, seriously, is a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. It's one of my favorite parts of the Old Testament. In these three stories, we have this giant plant that just grows up overnight out of nowhere. There's a superworm that comes and eats it. There's a floating zoo. There's the very first rainbow ever. And these details grab us, and they bring us back to the stories again and again. But those curious details, I would suggest, can be a distraction. They can be a distraction from what the stories teach us. They can be a distraction from what the stories have in common. The first thing that they have in common is that these are stories of people who came face to face with Yahweh God. The second thing that they have in common is that each of them challenge us to ask questions about evil and about righteousness. And a third thing that they have in common is that having pushed us to ask those questions, they raise more questions and they don't give us any answers. But what they do is they leave us standing face to face with Yahweh God and looking at our own reflection. These three writings give us food for thought, and they give us food for wisdom. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a couple of words. These are two words with their Hebrew equivalents, and the Hebrew equivalent is what appears in the text of the original writings. The first word is evil, and the Hebrew word for evil is ra'ah. Everybody say ra'ah. Ra'ah. Sounds a little Klingon, or is that just me? Ra'ah. Evil is defined as moral wrong or destructive hurtfulness. So the way Bible writers use the word evil, it can mean an action or a word or an attitude or a thought that does harm. It can also mean demonic activity, supernatural harm that happens by the actions of supernatural beings, or it can actually mean simply like the damage that is done by a tornado when it rips through a town. That word evil is a very broad, encompassing phrase or term in the Old Testament that encompasses all of the harm and the damage that happens to human beings on earth. The next word is righteousness, and in Hebrew it's tzaddik. Everybody say tzaddik, tzaddik. And that means being in a position where you are correctly aligned with what is right and with what is true, with what is healthy. And it can be used almost as a legal term in the Old Testament, legal language that indicates that a person is not guilty. They may have been charged with something, but they are not guilty. They didn't do it. They are righteous. They are on the right side of the law. And these three writings that we're going to look at very quickly this morning, I encourage you to read them, have a lot to say about evil and righteousness. So let's begin by digging into Noah. Of course, you can't dig into Noah because he was on a boat, so that wouldn't work. All right. Noah. The story of Noah is contained in the book of Genesis, and the book of Genesis is a history. So Noah is a history story. And if you look at the Pew Bibles, if you want to look at the Pew Bibles, it's really kind of interesting to see sort of how Noah fits into the larger story of the Old Testament. So start on page 1 of your Bible. Page 1, the world was created. Okay? Page 2, humanity was created. Page 4, we've already committed the first murder. Page 5, we've started spreading across the earth, and we're building cities, we're inventing technology, and we are creating art. And by the time we get to page 6, God looks at the earth, and the text says the earth had become corrupt. And that word for corrupt, think of that, like you find a really nasty old apple at the back of the drawer in your fridge, and you're like, I don't know when I bought that apple, but I am not touching it with my hands, so you go and get a pair of gloves or something. Okay, the earth was like that apple in the back of the drawer. It's like, ew. This is how we looked from God's perspective. God looked at the earth and he went, ew. And it also says that the earth was filled with violence, filled with cruelty, and filled with injustice, filled with intentional acts between human beings against each other that are evil. And in Genesis chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, this is where I'm looking right now, God observed all of this ew in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. So it's page 6, and aren't we off to a great start already? We're not doing well. So, the Lord observed on the slides, we've got Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 6. The Lord observed the extent of human ra'ah on the earth. And he saw that everything that they thought or imagined was entirely ra'ah all the time. So the Lord was sorry that he had ever made them and put them on the earth. And his heart was grieved. And then, in a few verses later, we meet Noah. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a tzaddik man, a righteous man, the only blameless person living on earth at the time. And he walked in close fellowship with God. Noah was a righteous man. Noah was a man who lived his life aligned correctly with what is right and what is true. And he's living his life entirely surrounded by people who are doing moral wrong and destructive harm all the time. I just think that sounds exhausting. I can't imagine what that was like for Noah. So Noah lives his life of tzaddik, of righteousness. He does that by obeying God. God tells him to do things, and Noah does them. And several times throughout the story, we read, God told Noah to, and he did. And it's emphasized, the writer of this story emphasizes it in verse 22. And in the original, it says, Noah did all that God commanded him. He did indeed. They're underlining it. They're underscoring it. They're saying everything that God told Noah to do, he did. So God told Noah, prepare for the flood, draw up the plans, build the ark, gather the supplies, organize everything for the animals and the people. So Noah did. And then he waited until God said, okay, it's time to get in the ark. So Noah did. And then they waited until God said, finally, after all of that, okay, it's time to come back out of the ark. And so they did. And they stepped out into the sunshine that was just starting to warm the world that had been given a second chance. So in Noah's story, we see evil and we see righteousness. Evil, ra'ah, is found everywhere. It's found in a corrupted humanity and in a corrupted creation. And we see righteousness, we see tzaddik found in one family who were doing what God told them to do. So that is evil and righteousness in the story of Noah. Next, we come to the story of Job. Has anybody actually read the book of Job? It's worth reading. It is amazing. It's very, very different from Noah's story because there's very little actual story. Not much happens in the book of Job. Most of it happens among 4 or 5 guys basically just sitting, like literally sitting. It's a record of their conversation. It's a record of the wisdom, the philosophy that they shared with each other. Because in the story of Job, what happens is not the point. What is said is the point. So, we begin the story of Job. Job 1, verse 1. And if you're interested in taking a look at it, it's page 455 in the Pew Bibles. Job 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And this man was blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from ra'ah. He turned his back on evil. And if you read the book of Job, start by reading the first 2 chapters and the last chapter. And then you sort of get a framework for where this is all going. And then read the rest in between. Because Job begins by living the dream. I mean, his life was good. He turned his back on evil. His life was good. Business was good. His family was happy. Their relationships were healthy and loving. Everybody was healthy and happy and growing, and life was good until suddenly it wasn't. And it really, really wasn't. Job lost everything. And Job's wife, who gets a bad rap, also lost everything. And Job has no idea why this has happened to him. But everything is gone. His kids, his health, his livestock, his money. Job and his wife lose everything, which does not make any sense because everybody knew in that world that if you were living a righteous life, God would bless you. And if you were living a sinful life, God would punish you. So people hear what has happened to Job, and some friends come to see him. And it starts well. They start off on the right foot. In chapter 2, verse 13, it says, Job's friends came, and they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word. They saw that his grief was too great for words. His friends got it. They understood that Job was hurting so bad. This was his silence, and it was his to break. And they had no right to speak into a situation that they themselves could not understand. But then Job begins to speak, and he begins by lamenting everything that has happened to him and saying he doesn't understand why this is happening to him. And I think for those 7 days, maybe his friends might have just been sort of sitting there waiting. You know, that's like sometimes you're waiting for your chance to speak. You're just like, okay, I know what I want to say, and as soon as I get a break in the conversation, I'm going to say it, and I'm not really listening to what everybody else is saying. I'm waiting for my chance to speak. And as soon as they had a chance to speak, they just jumped in there and started telling Job all of their smartness. And I'm sure that they were well-intentioned. I'm sure that they wanted to help. because Job was their friend. And they thought that if they could just get Job to admit whatever it was that he had done, that he was being punished for, if they could just get him to say it, just admit it, then maybe God would stop punishing him. In chapter 4, these conversations begin in earnest, and one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, says in effect to Job, "Look, buddy, you have helped other people who have gone through tough times. You have strengthened other people. Now let us help you. We all know how the world works. We know that God punishes evil." And Eliphaz asks this question, okay, come on, let's be real, Job. In verse 17 of chapter 4, can a mortal man be righteous before God? Really? Can a great man be pure before the Creator? And he assumes the answer is no. But Job is not pretending to be perfect. Job knows that he has not done anything to deserve this kind of punishment. But he's not pretending to be perfect. But he turns to his friends and he fights back and he says, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to give you what you want from me. And he's kind of challenging them and saying, in effect, look, it's bad enough that I'm dealing with all of this. And you're blaming me for my suffering? You're blaming me for this? At first, Job's was dealing with the ra'ah, with the evil of just this devastating, out of nowhere grief and pain. And now he's got to deal with the ra'ah of this slow, relentless drip of people saying, look, buddy, God doesn't give us more than we can handle. God doesn't give us stuff we don't deserve. So just confess and everything will be fine. And Job's like, I don't have anything to confess. And Job makes this speech in verse 27, or chapter 27, verses 3-6. And he says, as long as I live, while I have breath from God, my lips will speak no wrong, my tongue will speak no lies, and I will never concede that you are tzaddik. I will never concede that you are right. I will defend my integrity until I die. I will maintain my innocence without wavering. My conscience is clear for as long as I live. Any Star Trek fans here? Have you seen the episode where Picard is being tortured? And they're trying to get him to they'll say, we'll stop torturing you if you will just look at this wall and tell us that there are 5 lights on the wall. And Picard just like, no, there are 4 lights. And this is Job saying, there are 4 lights. I know what the truth is. I don't care what you say to me. I know what is true. And in chapter 31, Job presents this detailed defense of himself, all of the things that he is not guilty of. He says, I have never cheated in business. I have never stolen anything. I have never mistreated my servants. I have never withheld food from the poor. I have never ignored the needs of the widow and the orphan. I have never left the naked without warmth and clothing. I have never engaged in physical violence. I have never worshipped my wealth. I have never worshipped the sun and the moon. I have never rejoiced over the misfortune of or wished for the death of my enemy. I have never left travelers to spend night out in the open. I have never been lazy. And anytime I did something wrong, I admitted it. I have never tried to cover up for myself. Job doesn't just defend himself and say, I didn't do anything wrong, I'm innocent. Job goes on the offense. He's playing offense here. And he's pointing at his friends and he's saying, you want to know where evil is? It's in you. It's in your falsehood. It's in your presumption. It's in your arrogance, trying to drive a wedge between me and my God when all I have left is my God. And in the end, Job is proven right, and God shows up and tells his friends, you guys got it wrong. You need to make this right. So in the story of Job, we see evil and we see righteousness. And it's kind of not where we expect. In the story of Job, we see evil found in the men who are convinced of their own righteousness. And we see righteousness found in the man who is being accused of evil. The third story is the story of Jonah. And the story of Jonah falls into the category of prophecy. And it's on page 884 of the Bibles in the pews if you're interested in following along. The book of Jonah is a prophecy book because it's about Jonah, and Jonah was a prophet, and it's about the message that Jonah was supposed to deliver. And it's very, very different from the other books of prophecy. The other books of prophecy are almost entirely the message that any particular prophet was given to deliver. In the book of Jonah, it's more just about Jonah himself and who he is. And there's a lot more to Jonah the prophet than just the story that we find in the book of Jonah. See, long before Israel's time in exile in Babylon and in Persia, long before any of that happened, they had a king named Jeroboam II. And this is found in 2 Kings chapter 14. And Jeroboam II ruled Israel for 41 years, which is long enough to figure it out and long enough to get things right. But like the kings before him and like the kings after him, Jeroboam II did ra'ah in the sight of the Lord. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And according to the way Job's friends thought it should work, and the way a lot of people thought it should work in that day, God should have punished Jeroboam. But God did not. God actually blessed Jeroboam and his kingship. And he did that by sending a prophecy through, guess who? Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet. God sent a message through Jonah to King Jeroboam II, promising that God was going to give Israel back some land that they had lost to invaders, some territory that they desperately needed. God was going to give it back to them as a blessing for the people of Israel. So why? Why would God do that? If the king was evil, why did God bless the nation? Well, the text actually tells us exactly why God did this. 2 Kings 14, verses 26 to 27, the text says, he did this because the Lord saw the bitter suffering of everyone in Israel. They were struggling to just survive. They needed to be rescued in order to keep the name of the nation of Israel alive. So the Lord saw the bitter suffering of everyone in Israel, and that there was no one in Israel, slave or free, to help them. So God used Jeroboam II to save them. He used the only king they had, evil Jeroboam II, to save his people. And I wonder how Jonah felt about bringing that message to King Jeroboam II. Because part of being a prophet is taking a stand for what is right, for taking a stand for what is true, even when you're facing incredible opposition, to stand and say, this is wrong, and this is right. A prophet's task was to bring people back to living the way God wanted them to live. And instead, Jonah was given this commandment to go to this evil king and say, hey, good news, God's going to bless you. And you might hope that having had this experience of being given back this land by God, that this evil king would learn something, would turn back to God out of gratitude. But no, he continues to do evil until the day he dies. And in fact, later on in Jeroboam's reign, another prophet, the prophet Amos, comes to him and prophesies The exact opposite. He comes to the king and says, you know what? God's going to take that land back away from you again because you have not learned anything and you are still doing evil. And when that happened, when Jonah's people lost that land again, when that happened, when Jonah's people suffered because of that great loss, because of evil King Jeroboam, when they came up against the brutality and the cruelty and the impoverishment that meant, guess what? That happened at the end of the sword of Nineveh. And now, the Lord gives a message to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh, announce my judgment against it. Probably thought, oh, that sounds good. I'll enjoy delivering that message. Because God says, its ra'ah, its evil, has risen up in front of me. But Jonah has history with God. Jonah has seen God do good for someone who does not deserve it. Jonah knows that God is a God of grace. He knows that the armies and the king of Nineveh are responsible for devastation and slaughter and torture and looting and the deaths of Jonah's people. And Jonah has been a survivor of that, but he is still a prophet, and God has given him a message for another evil king. And Jonah's antenna are like, his radar is like, I think I know how this is going to end. And just as Jonah had feared, God gives Nineveh a second chance. And Jonah is not happy. And in fact, the text says this, when Jonah realized that God was going to show grace to Nineveh, this is what the text says. It was ra'ah to Jonah, with great ra'ah. Jonah thought that God's decision was evil. And whatever Jonah's excuse, however we might be able to sort of relate to his emotional landscape in that situation, because it must have been hard for him, what resides within Jonah, this man who would have happily sat back and watched Nineveh just burn, what resides within the prophet of God is not righteousness, is not tzaddik. It's self-righteousness, and it's hatred. And in the story of Jonah, we see a lot of ra'ah. We see a lot of evil in both Nineveh and Jonah. But you know what we don't see anywhere in this story? We don't see any tzaddik. Nowhere. Not once does that word appear anywhere in this story, not even in the happy ending. But what we do see instead is mercy in the acts of compassion. We see repentance in stepping back from judgment and condemnation. We see steadfast love in acts of kindness. We see pity in acts of care and preservation. And where do we see those things? Not in Jonah. We see those things in God. God, the only one who could claim in that story to be tzaddik, to be righteous, the only one in the story who is pure enough and holy enough and righteous enough to actually enact judgment against everyone else in the story. Instead, he uses his power and his authority to be kind. One of the biggest, most common things that come up in conversation these days, I find, is a question of something called, people don't use this word, only people like me use this word, theodicy. Theodicy is from two Greek words, theos, which means God, and dike, which means justice. And the discussion of theodicy is the discussion of how do we explain why a perfectly good, a perfectly almighty, a perfectly all-knowing God permits evil to happen. And this is one of, if not the greatest, unanswered questions that people carry with them. Why do bad things happen to good people? And to be honest, for me, I struggle even more with the question of why do good things happen to bad people? And what I learned from these three strange stories is this: it is always easier to find evil than it is to find righteousness. What I learned from these stories is that, people sometimes try to be good, but God is good. And from his perspective, his eye view, he sees the end from the beginning. What I learned from these strange stories is that when people suffer, and people will suffer, my responsibility is to speak truth, not to make assumptions, to offer the comfort that I'm able to offer, to humbly bring what help I can bring. And what I learned from these stories is that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask hard questions, to ask angry questions about why is there so much evil and why does there seem to be so little righteousness. And I know that it's okay to ask those questions, not because I expect to get answers, but because in asking the questions, I have to look God in the face. Jonah didn't get to live to see it. But if he had lived for another 150 years, he would have got his wish. Because Nineveh didn't learn their lesson any better than Jeroboam did. Nineveh continued to do evil. In Nahum chapter 3, verse 1, there is this heartbreaking prophecy. Nahum says this: "What sorrow awaits Nineveh, the city of murder and lies. You are crammed with wealth. You are never without victims." And Nahum goes on to describe the scene of the destruction of Nineveh. And then he concludes this by saying, "Nineveh, there is no healing for your wound. Your injury is fatal. All who hear of your destruction will clap their hands for joy. Because where can anyone be found who has not suffered from your continual ra'ah?" And I like to think that if Jonah had lived long enough, he might have learned enough about his own capacity for ra'ah, about his own need for mercy, that he might have been able to grieve for Nineveh. But then I like to think that if I were to live another 150 years, I might learn enough about my own need for mercy, that I might be able to look at the people whose names I can think of as I stand here, who I have seen do ra'ah, and that I might be able to grieve for them. Because we are living in Jonah's world, where there is so much evil, there is so much harm, and there is so little righteousness. There is so much bad happening to good people. There is so much good happening to bad people, and seeing that just hurts. It's frustrating, and it is very tempting to allow anger to ferment into the poison of hatred and to become ra'ah. Usually when I'm writing a sermon, when I'm writing a message, I try to come back to, Paul and I call it the so what. What's the so what? What is the practical response to what we have been studying this morning? What do we do about this? But in a conversation about evil and righteousness in the world, about justice and injustice, about suffering and blessings that we do not understand, there is no easy conclusion. There aren't, 3 simple things to do when you get up on Monday morning that are going to help you to navigate this. Reading books like Noah and Jonah and Job, I find that they can help because they acknowledge my questions. They acknowledge that, okay, I'm not the only one who is frustrated by this. I'm not the only one who wonders, why does God do the things that he does? They raise more questions than they answer, and maybe that's the point. Maybe that's why they have been given to us in the passages of Scripture. They've been given to us to remind us that, yeah, you know what, life raises more questions than it answers. And God doesn't offer us answers. He does offer us himself. So I want to conclude this morning by praying through together a passage from the prophet Isaiah. You can find this in chapter 55 of the book of Isaiah. And again, there are no answers in this passage of Scripture. There's nothing simple here that we can take away and put it on a T-shirt and go, okay, now I know I know what to think. I know how to deal with everything. I know how to process the evening news. I know how to process what's happening, when I see stuff. So I'm going to read this through, and I encourage you to just close your eyes and hear the words of God. The God who recognizes evil. The God who recognizes righteousness, and in between creates a path of mercy and of faithfulness and of love. Let's just hear the words of God speaking over us this morning. God says this: "My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts. My ways are far beyond anything that you could imagine. For just as the skies are higher than the earth, my ways are higher than yours. My thoughts are higher than yours. But know this: the rain and snow come down from the skies and stay on the ground and water the earth. They cause grain to grow, seed for the farmer and bread for the hungry. And it is the same with my word. The things I say always produce fruit. My word will accomplish all I want it to, and it will prosper everywhere I send it. And you will live in joy. You will live in peace. The mountains and the hills will burst into song, and the trees of the fields will clap their hands. And once there were thorns, noble trees will grow. Where stinging nettles grew, fragrant evergreens will sprout up. And these events will bring great honor to the Lord's name. They will be an everlasting sign of his power and of his love."